Welcome to Bloomberg Opinion's team chat this today with author Anya Bremzen, whose new book, National Dish Around the World in Search of Food, History, and Home, has just been published in the United States, and it's a very timely publication. Uh, the entire subject is you tell us when I heard that Anya was writing this book because I correctly assumed that she was going around the world to taste all these wonderful dishes, which is true. I'm not so jealous of the fact that she had to deal with learning all of the intricacies and sensitivities involved in what people consider their national dish, because there's so much proprietary nature, so much territoriality, so much this is our history, this is not yours, this is the way you do it, this is the way we don't. So uh, navigating those sensitivities are always very, very difficult, even without food involved. Uh, but Anya, what inspired you to do this book in the first place?
Well, I've always been thinking about these yummy, delicious dishes that you would be envious of me eating, like pizza in Naples and ramen in Tokyo and tacos or mole or tortillas in Mexico. But I knew that behind them, there were difficult and often turbulent histories, and that only part of the story kind of made its way onto pages of cookbooks and travel articles. The other impetus was that in our globalized world, these dishes and others have become so incredibly international and widespread that you get a pizza at a remote village in Japan. You get ramen, they call it tallarines cuadrados, the square noodles, in remote indigenous villages in Mexico. And that made us more protective of our heritage. You'd think that kind of this national cravings would dissolve, but in fact, globalization made us focus a lot more on the local, on the whole idea of authenticity, which is kind of like a marketing ploy. So these were questions that felt really important and timely as the world got more globalized, and on the other hand, nationalism became stronger than ever.
In fact, national plays an important part in the very last section of your book, which is of course at the forefront of what's happening now. Uh, for borscht, uh, and when borscht has always been considered a pan sort of Soviet, and the Soviet Union broke up, and but then everyone continued to eat and prepare. But when Vladimir Putin decided to invade Ukraine this last year uh, in February, one of the most successful initial Ukrainian counterattacks was to have the United States declare borscht Ukrainian. But that, of course, set off a whole of debates. Uh, the Russians were furious. Russians who loved Ukrainians were furious. Ukrainians were very possessive. Can you describe what happened as someone who grew up in Russia? How did you feel about all of this?
The feelings are very complex, and it's the epilogue of the national dish that I wasn't intending to write. I had something else in mind about Thanksgiving in my multicultural neighborhood in Queens. But then the war broke out, and literally there was a pot of borscht made by my mom that sat in my fridge. And borscht is not just a pan Soviet food, it was a pan Slavic food. It's, of course, shared by Poland and Lithuania, and Moldovans have it, and it's got a very old origin story. And those origin stories, they're not always authentic, but this one does, in fact. And the battle for borscht actually started in 2014 when Putin first invaded eastern Ukraine. And the whole kind of battle started with, I think, the Russian Ministry of Culture or Interior Ministry tweeting, saying borscht is a Russian dish, it's our dish. And in the context of the war that already started, the Ukrainian social media space just exploded, saying, how can you say that? This is cultural appropriation. And so the petition and the idea to have borscht inscribed in UNESCO kind of started around there then. But then the latest part of the invasion happened, and it's kind of intensified this whole battle over borscht as not just a national dish, but for Ukrainians, it's really a symbol of so many things. They cooked it for the Maidans, for the various protests, for the various revolutions on public squares. They cooked it for weddings, for funerals, for now they cook it for soldiers who return home from their battles. So it's
So it
really
has
this like,
become a truly nationalist symbol of the resistance
yes, as one writer told me,
Russian encroachment.
it's red like our blood. And when they finally made the successful petition and it came about to inscribe it in UNESCO as an endangered part of cultural heritage, of course, Russians started saying, "Oh yes, they can't share it. It's just it's emblematic. They're just Nazis." It was really ugly, but it was a big win for the Ukrainians. And usually, after spending so much time researching national dishes, I'm wary of nationalism and of these kind of gastro-national claims to heritage. But this was one example of where it really made sense and it really kind of boosted the national morale. And but for me, as someone as a Russian-speaking Jewish American person who grew up eating borscht all my life in Moscow and now here, I felt like I kind of had to relinquish it as part of my history and look at it as part of Ukrainian history. And this is a very good example of how our own identities, national identities, and other identities can change overnight in response to something like a war. So it's very fluid and it's very complicated.
And it's as I can tell from the way you said it, it's also very emotional because it's been part of your identity, but then the complexities of all of global politics, of war, and everything have led you to at least this conclusion. Uh, you had this wonderful line about uh, Ukrainians about whether how they could possibly share borscht with their former Russian neighbors again, and it looks like it's going to be a long, long time.
Yeah, the Ukrainians on the well, when the Russians lose the war and Ukrainians win the war, and then 2 generations later, maybe we can share the dish again. But this kind of blows up this whole cliche that food is there to be shared, or that the comforts of the food of our childhood are something existential. Like for me, the dish of my childhood brought a discomfort. So it just shows this fascinating complexity of food as, among other things, a national symbol.
Because otherwise food has a way of like crossing borders almost seamlessly, and you can see how a dish from one side of the border maybe have the same name as one on the other side, but are completely different, and yet somehow they influence each other.
Absolutely.
The entire you have this wonderful section about the food of the former Ottoman Empire and how so many things are similar throughout. There is a wonderful cosmopolitan nature to Turkish, so-called Turkish food, but it's really because the Ottoman Empire over so much of Europe and the Middle East that so much is similar. Can you give a description of how you cross borders and see all these things happening? Turkey, for example, where you also live.
Where I have a house, well, yes, I have a part-time home in Istanbul, and Istanbul is a former seat of the Ottoman Empire, had this incredible cosmopolitanism because empires by nature are cosmopolitan. The Soviet Empire was multicultural, right? The Austro-Hungarian Empire. So all these different strands of cuisine were part of the Ottoman cuisine in Istanbul. Turkish, the idea of Turkey didn't really exist until Ataturk created a modern nation state from the ruins of the Ottoman Empire, exactly 100 years ago. But there were Armenian dishes, Greek dishes, Balkan dishes. It was really a melting pot. But when nations form and they create their sort of nation building narratives, food becomes a part of it. I mean, think of hummus, for instance. Think of dolma. Think of so many Middle Eastern, so-called Middle Eastern specialties that were eaten hundreds of years before the current borders existed. We forget that there was no Syria, no Lebanon, obviously no Israel before the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, right? And suddenly you have all these claims to different dishes. And UNESCO, it means well by trying to decolonize heritage and assigning all these dishes, inscribing all these dishes into the intangible heritage list. But in fact, it's creating a lot of controversy because, for instance, it gave dolma, stuffed vegetables, stuffed grape leaves, to Azerbaijan, of course, which made Armenians extremely unhappy. Then it gave lavash to Armenia, which made Turks and Azerbaijan is extremely unhappy. These are very politically charged zones currently. With the current state of affairs, let's say, between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and often food serves as a proxy for these larger conflicts because food is something we can identify with. It's something that we eat every day. So it's very easy to call this larger conflict, let's say, between Israel, Palestinians, the Middle Eastern conflict, the hummus war. We understand this word. It makes it all easy, but what's really behind it is what I wanted to write and investigate in National Dish.
One of the things that's interesting, certain dishes like pizza, for example, have become universal dishes. And yet the Italians, especially the Neapolitans, are very, very, very possessive about what is actually pizza. Can you talk about what your discovery of how the sensitivities of the people of Naples are with what actually makes pizza pizza?
Well, first of all, the first thing to remember is that there was no Italy until 1860s. And it's another thing that I stress in National Dish, that the whole idea of a modern nation is so recent. And pizza was a particular Neapolitan specialty and had to do with urban overcrowding. Naples in the 19th century was 10 times the urban density of Victorian London, for instance. And pizza was a cheap food costing only one soldo, like a penny, that could feed all those people who semi lived on the street. And pizza is definitely, some dishes are disputed. Pizza is Neapolitan because that's where, for the first time, the tomato met dough in around, let's say, 1760s. And it has to do with a particular technique. But pizza in northern Italy, this was a surprise for me. In northern Italy, it was unknown and it was scorned. So even in the late 19th century, someone like Carlo Collodi, the creator of Pinocchio, compared it to complicated filth. He wrote this like really kind of disparaging, and it sort of echoed, the slightly, racially colored
The North
thinking
versus South.
about the North, yeah, where the South was always compared to Africa, so there was always that. And then it was really the Italian immigrants that fled, the post-unification chaos and poverty that popularized pizza here. And you could argue that it became a national dish of Italy in
Through the
exile
United States,
through United States, through the South America, because it really took
Argentina,
off in
yes.
Argentina as well, and it sort of returned to Naples, and it became popular really just after World War II, and especially popular in the 80s and 90s with the economic downturn, when suddenly everyone wanted a dish that cost under 10 euros, but that gave a complete sort of
Made you
was
full.
a complete meal. And but this globalization is kind of this other story. But in the 90s also, the Neapolitans are suddenly feeling very protective about it because it just kind of is out of control, and they establish all these rules and regulations, and it's happening all over the world with different ingredients and different dishes. This is the effect of globalization, that people are suddenly creating all these protective mechanisms.
There was a very amusing story in the Financial Times about the World Pizza Competition recently, and how at one part, a particularly good chef unthinkingly decided to add a little more cheese to his dough to make pastrami. And apparently the judges saw it, and it was against the rules, and he was disqualified. So it was.
I judged the pizza competition in Naples, which was quite something. And you know who were the biggest presence and the biggest contestants? The Japanese. There was NHK, Japanese television, all the top contestants, they were so well trained. They made this incredible pizza. And the Neapolitans were just going, well, what can we do? They're like better than us.
You went to Japan as well. Did you try the pizza when you were there? When you were doing the ramen, probably my favorite chapter is about your Japan. Did you get to you got to try the Japanese pizza, right? The pizza they made in Tokyo.
Yes, absolutely. Pizza is like a big thing in Tokyo right now, has been for the last 5 years, probably bigger than ramen. And there's this particular way that they do it that is slightly burnt. They pinch the edges, they pinch the dough. This is like the Tokyo style. So it becomes very inflated and very burnt and very sort of strange. And I spoke to this famous, celebrity pizzaiolo, and I said, "Have you ever been to Naples?" He said, "No, for the pizza we don't need it. We make it Japanese. It's our own thing. We, talking about the cultural appropriation." But he said, "I'd like to go for the beautiful women one day." So there we go.
Very similar to pizza for the Japanese is and the Northern Italians and pizza is ramen because it's not exactly considered uh, it's not haute cuisine. It's certainly it's fast food, right? But to everyone else, it's Japan.
Ramen is another very interesting story that really echoes the pizza story. Ramen is obviously Chinese. It's from Lamyan, and it started in the treaty ports of Yokohama, for instance, in the Chinatowns there, a variation on a Chinese dish. And it really became popular in Japan, let's say in the interwar period, as a cheap starch. First, it was sold from carts, from yatai carts, then in Chinese restaurants. But where it really took off and became kind of very consciously canonized as a national dish is in the period after the World War II, when it was so important in the post-war reconstruction. Again, you have this cheap starch that can feed a lot of people, that allows sort of variations in toppings and seasonings, which is the idea that came in later. And then, of course, Momofuku Ando invents the instant ramen, and the Japanese considered
That's
the
what it is.
greatest Japanese invention. Never mind that he was actually born in Taiwan. That's sort of something that no one talks about. And then it really takes off, just like pizza, as a gourmet items during the downturn in the 90s, when people are looking for something that's cheap and filling, but also can be subjected to the auteur, to creative variations, again, in toppings, flavorings, seasonings. So it's a very similar and very fascinating trajectory, pizza and ramen.
And then you describe all these variations, and you went go to more more elegant sort of manufacturers, and give us a couple of examples of the flavors that you partook of.
Well, they manufacture something called sugamen, which is a ramen that hasn't been, it's still an instant ramen, but it hasn't been fried. And it's really fascinating how they do the research, the company. It's called Yamadai. They send all these tasters and all these researchers to different regions to figure out what style is popular there. And then they bring out, for instance, the best-selling ramen when I went there was with the Kyoto leek that was dried, but when it's like this incredible regional leek. So that was the flavor that year. It could be something spicy, is very popular right now among the millennial eaters.
Uh, and but it's very interesting because Japan has a sort of nationalistic sort of uh, uh, dish compared to ramen, which is a very popular one. But you talk about gohan, which is the rice meal, which it's very austere, but there it's a bit of a cult in the way people approach how they need to eat this. What makes us Japanese? Can you can you talk about that and how how recent a phenomenon it actually is?
Cooked rice is something incredibly symbolic, and it's been promoted as something that represents the Japanese self. It's imbued with this almost mystical aura. Rice farming, rice paddies, it's really connected to nationalism in this very strong way. And there's, again, this racialized aspect because the whiteness represents the purity of the Japanese self. And it's all part of these theories called Nihonjiron, which is like a essentialist Japanese theories. And it's the basis of the Japanese meal called washuko, which also got UNESCO status, where you eat it with miso soup and different side dishes, like rice and three, right? Rice and three side dishes. And it's been promoted endlessly, and Japanese people really respect it. The problem is that rice consumption is falling dramatically in Japan, especially Tokyo, which is a completely globalized city, where the ramen sales are pretty much steady. Rice sales is a really huge problem because Japan has subsidized its rice farmers for a very long time, and these subsidies are changing now. And I talked to this seller of rice, distributor of boutique gourmet rices, and he said the farmers just have no motivation. So you have this something that's elevated as a national symbol, but how are national symbols faring in the age of globalization, which is another uh, thing that I try to find out in national dish. And sometimes they're not faring very well, despite all the hype.
And sometimes it becomes a really the thing and trying to define what exactly is it makes up a national dish. For example, uh, you were talking about the foods of Mexico, and there's so much politics involved in, say, the making. Is it or is it the and it's so work intensive that it actually increases the in society because women are mostly having to do all the work, and so they don't get to do anything else. Can you talk about how the national dish actually doesn't help very much in terms of national progress?
That's a complicated question. I was actually talking about the handmade tortilla,
Right.
and
I'm
one
sorry.
the maize handmade maize
Yes.
tortilla, which likewise has been elevated into the status of Mexicanness very recently, in fact, because all throughout Mexico's colonial history, there was this drive to obliterate the maize diet in favor of the wheat diet, which was equated with progress and civilization and the whitening. Again, we have this racial aspect, the whitening of Mexico's indigenous population. But with NAFTA and with the scare of GMO contamination of Mexican maize, this really powerful grassroots movement arose that started protecting the tortilla and maize as national symbol. And everyone is now idealizing the handmade tortilla. Oh, heirloom corn, what a beautiful thing, the handmade tortilla, which it is a beautiful thing. But I go and investigate what it is like for indigenous women to produce a daily quota of, let's say, 200 tortillas to feed a large family. And it's backbreaking labor. There's a lot of health issues from smoke inhalation. There's a lot of knee and shoulder injuries from using the comal, from using the metate, because even if the masa is already, the corn dough is already ground, you still have to flatten it with the metate. And for all the women who sell tortillas at markets for nothing, I mean, literally the profit is $7 a day after hours of grueling work. So I talk to indigenous politicians, I talk to cooks, I talk to scholars, feminist scholars. Is it worth it? And what can we do to change it? And this brilliant indigenous Zapotec politician, Efrosina Cruz Mendoza, who was like the first Zapotec woman in parliament, she said, no, we can't lose it. We need to make the tortillas by hand, considered masaca contaminated, but we need to educate men to help out. They can get at least the firewood for the kamal, for the hearth. They can help. They just we need to change a change in attitude, not to be for this not to be just women's work.
But you can
There's
also imagine that you need a change in the economics of valuing the work that these women do and these people do to make, if it's a handmade tamal, it has to be more than just, $7 a day that you can make off it because it's basically artisanal work.
no, but then it migrates into a different category of being this gourmet item.
Uh,
Uh, And what do you do? I mean, people are going to revolt. I mean, the price of tortilla is a huge, it's like this tortilla-nomics, I call it, is this huge issue in Mexico, and even a handmade tortilla. So like once it becomes the object of consumption of rich people and foreigners, then
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 it
then
no
that's
longer is their food. You're
no,
right.
exactly.
Uh, but it's incredible how things like, and then of course the 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 thing that the alternative mass produce flour tortilla, and how does that compare to the handmade one?
Oh, it's a mass-produced corn tortilla,
Yeah, oh, corn
uh,
tortilla.
which is basically made from this, industrial corn dust, and it's loaded with stuff, and it might have GMO. But there's always tortilla activists in Mexico, and they're very clear-headed about it. They know that you can't bring on this revolution overnight. What they're asking, for instance, is more clear labeling on the industrial tortilla, so people know what they're actually consuming, and that they use more of maize criollo, the real maize, the heirloom maize. But it's a very delicate balance, because if suddenly there's this huge global demand for heirloom maize, for maize criollo, there'll be not enough for the peasants' own consumption. So these are very delicate issues and complicated, but fascinating as well. And I devote a lot of attention in National Dish to this kind of stuff.
Now we talked about how people has become a universal sort of thing, and yet people are very possessive. There was a recent statistic that the kind of restaurant that is most most of the latest startup restaurants, 40% of them are ramen shops. And so, what do you think is going to happen to ramen if it goes? It's already gone global, but is it even more global? I mean, there's a wonderful little shop here in London that specializes in Filipino Muslim halal ramen, and there are other variations around the world. Can you imagine like the equivalent of a pineapple pizza would somehow for ramen?
But the whole attraction of opening an indie ramen shop for the Japanese ramen masters in the 90s, again during the downturn, was the model, the business model. It was very cheap to open, because basically there's just a counter with 10 or 12 seats. People pay up and go. They don't kind of ramen is, you don't linger and socialize at the
So it's
ramen. So
so
people, it's just like a very
it's very fast. Yeah, I
very
see.
quick turnover. You have the noodles, which are not that expensive, and then you have a way to express yourself through all these different toppings, and tare and seasonings. So in a way, it was set up almost to become this hybrid something, and
Mhm.
this idea took off in the world. I mean, for the young indie restaurateurs who can't afford their own place, the ramen, which represents kind of the cool Japan brand, the sort of J-pop sensibility, is a very feasible business model. And as long as there are noodles and the dish is called ramen, the Japanese are not as protective about ramen, because it's already a Chinese
Originally,
originated
yes.
dish, as they would be about like rice, or the way that Neapolitans are about pizza. So yeah, I say go for it.
Now, one thing about national dishes is they also help define the sense of home, and that was one of the more touching things about what. And now that you've been through so many places, does it and to appreciate all these different foods, more diverse sense of home because you actually each of these national dishes so well.
Well, I'm an immigrant. We came as refugees. I speak several languages. I live between New York, the most globalized, the most multinational, multi-ethnic neighborhood in New York, and Istanbul. And but I was still clinging to my Russian identity, and I realized how much I've lost that, or how much I kind of rejected that during the wars, which is why coming back to the borscht and the epilogue, it was so poignant. This was a dish that was supposed to represent the comfort of home, but it started representing the discomfort of home, and the home that I've lost through basically just completely relinquishing my Russian identity because I wanted to have nothing to do with it, and I was so much on the side of Ukraine, and maybe discovering my own Ukrainian roots. My mom is from Odessa, and her family is from Ukraine, so it was a new start.
Well, thank you, Anya. This I'll go out and get a copy of National Dish. It's a complicated, a very, very, very sensitive subject, but it is a beautifully written book, full of spirit, full of emotion, and really, truly, truly a wonderful way to go around the world with someone as wonderful as Anya and as sensitive about all these subjects.
Thank
Thank
you,
you so
Howard.
much.
It was a pleasure.